Hello, class. Today we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday with formulating your position. Before formulating your position or taking a stance on an issue, it can be helpful to take stock of what exactly the issues are. The issues or questions about the topic you come up with will help illustrate the complexity of the issue and ensure that you do not develop an argument that is one-sided or polarized between yes and no. So what do we mean by this? Not necessarily in isolation of the AP test, but in general, when you're conducting research, if you want to do a topic around, let's say, technology, you will come up with all the questions you can think of regarding the topic you are thinking to discuss, right? And we'll look at what some of those questions will look like in a second. But then you want to try to dissect the complexity. What do we mean by the complexity of that? Well, how do all these questions connect to one another? Are there any common themes? Is there anything that we can use to help formulate our thesis? Any repeat offenders? So if you look at the image that's here, any of these lines where multiple points are going to a different segment, or there's a mass amount of green right here, right? That would be a repeat offender, and that is something that we would then focus on in an essay or in a thesis. So example issues that you could come up with when analyzing the text on the impact of technology on human intelligence. So like when we're reading a source, right? So is the easy access to information and instant gratification that digital technology affords creating an illusion that when it comes to human knowledge, speed and volume are better? To what extent is digital technology changing the way we interact with one another? Are some technologies, particularly social media, better than others? More dangerous than others? And to what extent has digital technology redefined basic concepts such as privacy, community, and public space in our society? Now, these are some questions that you would come up with once you start to do research about technology. And so what happens is when you do a research project, or even for the sake of the synthesis essay that's on the AP test, is as you read through sources, you're going to start asking some questions, right? As a question comes to your mind about the topic, you need to jot that down, because the next step is going to be taking those questions and trying to use them to develop a thesis. So these questions are really the starting point for what you ultimately end up arguing in your essay. Now, let's look at example thesis statements when analyzing the text on the impact of technology on human intelligence. So we can move from those questions, which they're questions, right, to a thesis statement. And we talked about this earlier in the year, but a thesis statement is a statement. It's not a question, right? So this is the thing we are definitively going to talk about. Some examples. The traditional balance of power in our society is being reshaped by digital technology, since its most capable and creative users belong to a younger generation of digital natives. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about when we're discussing thesis statements is whatever topic you choose and whatever your thesis is, it should not be in response to a question that is yes or no. Okay, when you're formulating research questions, which are the things that the questions we were looking at on the previous page, you cannot come up with a research question that is a yes or no question. If you do, it is not in depth enough to then write about. Because if it's a yes or no answer, that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for discussion or argumentation, right? So these are statements developed from those questions that people can be on both sides, right? You can argue both sides of each of these. Second example, although technology progress has changed the world in rapid and dramatic ways, the major benchmarks for personal and professional success all require skills that cannot be learned online. The next example, today's social media platforms may be old news in a flash, but their impact on the way we learn, interact with one another, and define ourselves will be revolutionary, enduring, and positive. And the last example of a thesis statement derived from these questions is while the internet, including social media, may be alluring, it has led humanity to turn its back on critical thinking and expert knowledge for shallow and often partial understanding of complex issues. So these are all examples, some of which directly come, I didn't mean to back up twice. Some of these directly come from these research questions that we looked at. So when you're coming up with your own research topic, which you will eventually do, it's really important that you start with those research questions as you start to kind of explore your topic before you settle on a thesis. Now, let's talk about the actual formulating of the essay, right? The first topic we're going to talk about is framing quotations. So when writing with sources, it's really important not to simply summarize or paraphrase the sources. You can't just drop a source in and walk away, right? And we've talked about this when we talked about the rhetorical analysis essay, but it's really, really important in a research paper to not just do a drop and run, right? You need to start by including at least a sentence or two to prepare readers for the quote ahead. We can refer to this as a lead-up sentence or two lead-up sentences. And these are sentences that are going to prepare our readers to receive the information that we're about to give them, okay? You don't just drop it on them and run, you prepare them for this. Once you have done the lead-up, and then you have given the fact or statistic, the next step is the warrant. And I've stressed warrants until I'm, blue in the face, but warrants are key. You should also always include a sentence or two, and this it may be longer depending on the importance of the information, of commentary to remind readers of your point and how the quotation reinforces it. In other words, how does the information you just gave me connect to your thesis? Now, this is important in all writing, but how does this relate to a synthesis essay or a research paper? Well, this relates to a synthesis essay because you, in any given essay, are probably writing about 4, 5, 10 plus sources. It's really hard to keep track of all those. And so you need to have some sort of explanation to, one, break up just, dropping facts everywhere, right? And two, to really string everything together. Because when you're pulling from sources that may have been written, 10 years apart from one another and in different areas of the world, it's up to you to connect those dots. Your warrants are a big part of connecting those dots. Integrating quotations. So when using multiple sources in your writing, it becomes even more important to incorporate the quotations in a way that is both clear and interesting. One of the things you should be doing in order to do this is to transition from your own voice to others' words and ideas in a smooth and natural sounding way. What do I mean by smooth and natural sounding way? You should only be able to tell that there's a quote in your paper based on the indications that you make, right? So like the quotation marks, for example, and by key phrasings like according to so-and-so, or, like the in-text citations, right? It shouldn't be a very hard shift. I know you guys aren't quite the driving age in the UAE, but I'm going to give you an example of a manual vehicle, right? I'm sure you've ridden in one, or maybe driven like one of the four-wheelers or ATVs, whatever, right? If you are driving a manual shifting vehicle, regardless of what that is, right? And you do not properly hit the clutch and shift, you'll get, or you're going too fast when you do it, you'll get a hard like jerk, or you'll get thrown forward a little bit because the motor's not quite ready for this. When you jump from what you're saying to what quotes or whatever, what the words of others, you give your reader that same sort of jolt. And that's not a good feeling. We want our arguments to be smooth and natural. Okay? So you really have to try to try to make that connection between the two. One of the most effective ways to do this is to integrate the quotations that you're trying to use into your own sentences. And we'll look at an example of this in a second. When you integrate quotations in this way, the reader can follow your ideas and see the sources in the context of your argument. So you will be explaining your point, whatever point you're trying to make with this quote or with this data, whatever it is, right? And you will only quote the important pieces of information within your own writing. This is something we've talked about before. It can be really hard to do this in a rhetorical analysis, because a lot of times what ends up happening is you only pull one word or a phrase or whatever. And while this might be the case in a synthesis essay, a lot of times there is more information from that other text that you want to use. So an example, writing in 1962, R. Smith Simpson lamented the abysmal ignorance of candidates for the Foreign Service, a prestigious government agency that should expect the best and the brightest to apply. When it came to so elementary of a subject as geography, he pointed out that few could even place accurately the principal rivers, including ones named after an actual state such as Ohio. Notice anything in quotations has directly come from this source material, but all the other words are the words of the author. Also notice that there's a combination happening here, right? The first mention from this source text is only the phrase abysmal ignorance. Why might we choose to quote specifically just one phrase? Well, sometimes the research that you're reading, the person has coined that phrase and you can't use it without citing it from them, right? They have made up that specific wording, or they're the people, the first people to describe something as whatever that phrase is, right? And then as we move on, using the description from the source, so elementary of a subject as geography, and then again your own words, few could even accurately place the principal rivers, including ones named after the actual state of Ohio. So again, if you were just listening to this, you wouldn't necessarily know that parts of this have come from or have been direct quoted from this piece, because it flows that smoothly. This is the model for what you should be doing in your own writing. It's really important that we're not jarring the reader. This is very smooth to read. Now, I will say this before I move on. It is really hard to get to this level, and most of the time on your first draft of something, you won't write this smoothly, and that's fine. But after you finish your essay, walk away from it, don't look at it for a while, and then go back to it, because you'll read it as a new person, okay? This always helped me when I was in university doing my undergrad. It helped me with my first master's, and now this one. It really does help to take a step back and then return to it with fresh eyes, because let's face it, we don't remember what we wrote in 10 minutes after we wrote it. Okay, I'm going to wrap this part here, and I will see you in part 2.